Oh, Heath!
You know, it really can't hurt to ring this special number. And remember, whether you're phoning from Belfast, Brighton or Balmoral, it's completely free. So go on, don't be bashful.
I love maths. I adore it. I like shapes and symbols and arithmetic and algebra.
Yes, thank you, Carol. That's quite enough. Goodbye.
Sunday evening on One, after songs of praise from Gateshead, there's a drop more from the last of the summer wine.
You want 3 teas, 3 sticky buns, 1 kiss and a cuddle on the ass.
At 7:45, the plot thickens in Howard's Way.
Gerald, this is like a chess game. My father set up the board and every damn move has to be played out.
At 8:35, family business in Bread.
Hang on. Who's this next up game?
At 9:20, party mayhem in Sticky Wickets.
I just don't believe this.
At 10:35,
Here in Boston earlier this year, 2 Christian Science parents were found guilty of the manslaughter of their son because they failed to call in medical care. Part of the matter examines their dilemma.
and this is the lineup for Sunday evening on BBC One.
A new series of The Money programme begins on BBC Two in about 10 minutes, with the first of 2 programmes focusing on the economic impact of the tensions in the Gulf. Tonight, exploring the risks to the world's financial system and the damage to business here at home. On BBC One now, it's 6:25, time for a summary of the latest news with Chris Lowe.
Edward Heath says the idea for his trip to Baghdad came from Douglas Turd, the Foreign Secretary. Not true, says Mr. Turd, speaking in Cairo. It was Mr. Heath's initiative. Israel says it will not cooperate with the UN mission to investigate the killing of 21 Palestinians in Jerusalem. And the Irish lift golf's World Cup in a sudden death playoff. Good evening. Edward Heath has said he was asked to go on his proposed visit to Iraq by the Foreign Secretary. But Douglas Turd has denied making any such request or giving Mr. Heath any encouragement to go. Mr. Heath is due to fly to Baghdad at the end of this week to try to secure the release of sick and elderly British hostages.
Mr. Heath was telephoned at his home in Salisbury 2 weeks ago. It was the first contact between him and Mr. Turd on the subject. And while Mr. Heath said today he was reluctant to discuss the conversation in case it made his mission more difficult, he did agree it was the Foreign Secretary who asked him to go to Iraq.
I think in fairness to Douglas Turd, I must say that the relatives of some of these people in Iraq and in Kuwait who are very ill and in one case dying, approached him and said, look, can't something be arranged? And he obviously treated it very seriously.
And he asked you, and you said you'd think about it, and you later told him you were prepared to go?
Yes, of course I had to think about it. Very large number of risks involved. But I finally said yes, if I was required, I was prepared to go.
Mr. Turd, who's in Cairo, has confirmed that he made the call, but his version of it is fundamentally different. And he's denied a report in today's Observer that Mrs. Thatcher was furious about the trip.
I did not ask Mr. Heath to go, and as regards the second point, the Observer is wrong. The Prime Minister was, of course, kept fully informed, and there was no objection.
But it's significant that when Mr. Heath first announced the visit at last week's Conservative Party conference, Mr. Turd didn't join in the widespread condemnation of his plans. Some cabinet ministers argued that the trip was bound to be misinterpreted and could end up embarrassing the government. Today's row has certainly been embarrassing, but Mr. Heath and Mr. Turd are agreed on one thing, that nothing further should be said that might endanger the chances of getting the release of at least some of the hostages.
The Foreign Secretary has hardened his language towards Iraq. He said Saddam Hussein has no choice other than to leave Kuwait of his own free will or at the point of a gun.
Nobody in their senses wants war or bloodshed. But there is a greater evil. The greater evil would be if we condemned our children to live in a world where force and brutality can scorn law, can ignore decent standards of behaviour.
Israel says it won't cooperate with the United Nations delegation which will investigate the killing of 21 Palestinians by police in Jerusalem 6 days ago. The decision was taken at a meeting of the cabinet. An Israeli human rights group has accused the security forces of firing indiscriminately during last Monday's clashes.
Israel's cabinet met this morning in a mood of defiance. Afterwards, the Security Council resolution was fiercely criticized by government spokesmen. There was no question of Israel cooperating with a UN mission to investigate the killings.
Absolute no. And this no comes because we consider that the Security Council did not take into consideration the fact that it was in pure self-defense, which is a legal principle, a moral principle existing in international law, in internal law. The police, the Israeli police, was there to defend itself, to defend its people.
The condemnation in the Security Council was one-sided and was unjust. This was a provocation on Jews praying in the holiest site of the Jewish people on a Jewish holy day. It's unbelievable.
This uncompromising line came as the official government inquiry into last Monday's deaths opened, amid accusations from an Israeli human rights group that the security forces fired indiscriminately. The group claimed that the shooting continued after danger had passed and that bystanders and medical workers were among the targets. But Israel's government has clearly decided to give vigorous support to its forces, however much embarrassment that might cause Western nations as they try to maintain their alliance with Arab countries against Iraq. Justin Webb, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Iraq and Iran have formally resumed diplomatic relations by reopening embassies in each other's capitals. 4 British Muslims have left Iraq and are on their way home after the intervention of Yusuf Islam, the former pop singer Cat Stevens. They'd been detained while on a pilgrimage to Muslim holy places.
The passports and the tickets to freedom of the first batch of British prisoners to be freed in this crisis. The bags, which they originally packed 3 months ago for the pilgrimage to the holy places in Iraq, were loaded up. These were the easiest cases. Muslim pilgrims in a country which is striving to present itself as the champion of the cause of Islam. And yet Yusuf Islam, formerly the singer Cat Stevens, wanted 5 British Muslims to be freed. The 5th, who's said to be mentally ill, is not for some unexplained reason being allowed to leave. Nor did Yusuf Islam manage to win the release of Maureen Wilbraham's husband. Tony Wilbraham has been diagnosed as having terminal cancer. So the 4 British Muslims left alone without the most serious cases.
This is a beginning. It's a good beginning, and I hope and pray that soon everybody will join.
It looks as though the Iraqis are keeping the British prisoners who are seriously ill, men like Mrs. Wilbraham's husband, in order to release them when Mr. Edward Heath comes here.
Well, I'm very happy for them, but I just wish that we'd have been going in the car instead of them, but of course that's being mean. Maybe this next week. We'll hope for the best when Mr. Heath comes.
As the lucky ones left from Baghdad airport, it was clear there was a hard, unsentimental logic behind Iraq's decision to release British Muslims before those who are seriously ill. Yusuf Islam didn't have the political clout to get the British sick and elderly released. Edward Heath does. John Simpson, BBC News, Baghdad.
After the defeat of Lebanon's Christian leader General Aoun, Syrian troops and Lebanese government forces have been tightening their grip on East Beirut, and they're still surrounding the French embassy where the general's taken refuge. Lebanese government officials say they want him to stand trial for embezzlement and crimes against the state.
Syrian troops continue to surround the French embassy, and the Lebanese government has made it clear that it's not willing to see General Aoun walk off scot-free and seems to want him to stand trial. It will all have come as something of a surprise to Aoun, who, when he fled from his bunker in the presidential palace yesterday, had visions of disappearing in a French helicopter to Cyprus. Indeed, that was the French intention, but for the moment it's been firmly scuppered. Lebanon's President Elias Harawi has been deliberating with his cabinet and talking to the French ambassador, but General Aoun remains trapped. Crossings between East and West Beirut are open for the first time for 2 weeks, following a blockade imposed upon Aoun by the Lebanese government. Michael Macmillan, BBC News in the Middle East.
Mrs. Thatcher has told the South African President F.W. de Klerk that she strongly supports his efforts to dismantle apartheid. She's again stressed her opposition to economic sanctions against the Pretoria government. British officials described the meeting at Chequers as very positive and constructive.
It's their second meeting here in 5 months, and since their last encounter there's been a further upsurge of violence in South Africa's black townships. President de Klerk, who was accompanied by his wife, wanted to give the Prime Minister his own assessment of what had been happening at home. Officials said it was a constructive meeting about the prospects for negotiating the end of racial segregation. But at the gates, anti-apartheid demonstrators insisted the peace process in South Africa was being threatened. They claim only 60 out of 1,200 political prisoners have been released. The Labour MP Robert Hughes delivered a letter to Mrs. Thatcher calling upon her to tell her guests to stop the violence and repression. President de Klerk returns to South Africa later today with the violence in the townships at the top of his political agenda.
Millions of voters in what was East Germany have been going to the polls in state elections. It's the first test of German opinion since reunification.
Democracy isn't yet commonplace here, but this is the third free election in 7 months in what used to be East Germany, and the turnout will be correspondingly down. But still, the states retain considerable powers under the German constitution, and both main parties, the ruling Christian Democrats and the opposition Social Democrats, have brought in Western politicians in some states to offer a government of competence and to appeal to a partly unemployed electorate. I hope, said this voter, that at least with this election things will finally start to roll and everybody will have work. We want to work. People have 2 votes, one for the Prime Minister of each state and the other for the members of Parliament. As many as 15 parties are on the ballot, but neither of the country's 2 foremost politicians. For Oscar Lafontaine of the Social Democrats, it's an important test of the strength of his challenge to Helmut Kohl for the Chancellorship in December. The Chancellor himself has quite as much at stake. He's campaigned in all the eastern states, and his party is expected to carry at least 4 of the 5. The polls have just closed, and the first exit polls suggest that this will indeed be the final result. A qualified but substantial victory for the ruling party. Martin Bell, BBC News, Berlin.
Ireland have won golf's Dunhill Cup at St Andrews for the 2nd time. They beat England in the final after a sudden death playoff.
A memorable finale to a championship never short of drama. Ireland won up in the final match, but an uncharacteristic miss on the 17th from their captain David Fairty. Then on the 18th, a chance for Howard Clark to win the cup for England. His miss sent the final into a sudden death playoff. At the 3rd extra hole, England were in trouble and Fairty seized the opportunity for Ireland. This time the 17th was to be a happier experience for the Irish captain. England's chance had gone as Fairty, with 2 putts, claimed the first prize. It was Ireland's 2nd victory in the competition in 3 years.
The doors of St Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square have been opened to worshippers for the first time since the Russian Revolution. After 1917, St Basil's and many other churches were turned into museums.
Within earshot of the Kremlin, Moscow's most famous landmark was celebrating a religious freedom unknown here for 70 years. The Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church able to hold the first services in St Basil's since the Bolsheviks turned it into a museum. The ritual mysteries of a church long persecuted by an atheist state are now tolerated. Many young Russians are turning to religion, seeking a fulfillment unavailable from their impoverished daily lives. But it's the older generation of believers, gathering for the first time on Red Square, who've made this victory possible, keeping their faith alive so that Christians may at last worship in the shadow of the red flag. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
And that's it. The main news tonight is at 9:05.
Good evening. Apart from the heavy showers over Ireland at the moment, the next lot of rain will be spreading up from the south
during tonight. We can take a quick look at those showers over Ireland, some of them quite heavy, and already we can see the first lot of rain beginning to spread up into parts of the southwest. But the bulk of the rain is all associated with this fairly angry looking cloud just off the northwestern coast of Spain. So those showers over Ireland tonight will be beginning to push through Northern Ireland, up the west coast of Scotland. At the same time, we find the cloud thickening up in the south. The rain fairly light at first, but it may turn fairly heavy as it works its way into the southwest, Wales, pushing back into Ireland and into some northern parts of England as well. A fairly mild night, certainly in the south. The temperatures in some places around about 14, at their lowest 9 in northern parts of Scotland. Tomorrow's weather chart shows the area of low pressure moving into Northern Ireland. Still these strong southerly winds, so some places still a little bit on the warm side, and certainly to begin with we find some of the central and eastern areas fairly bright with some sunshine. But the heavy rain pushing into Northern Ireland, into much of Scotland after a fairly bright start in the north, and then these heavy showers in the west will begin to push into central and eastern parts of England during the afternoon and evening, some of them quite heavy with thunder. Temperatures tomorrow again into the 20s, especially in the east, but in the wetter areas around about 13 or 14.
And now on BBC One, Alan Titchmarsh introduces Songs of Praise.
Would you believe that just a few years ago all this was derelict industrial land? Now it's the site of the National Garden Festival. Welcome to Gateshead. The old saying about taking coals to Newcastle would probably have been more accurate if it had warned about taking coals to Gateshead, because for over 300 years the output of the North Durham coalfields was exported from these staves, anything up to 4 million tonnes a year.